hello cuties, I'm back. And today we are doing another episode, episode 2 of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. Today, we are going to be doing another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books, which is what I am. And in this series, I like to do my makeup while I tell you about the latest book that I've read. Now, the latest book that I have read is a heavy one. If you can't tell by my face, obviously I've already filmed this video because my makeup is done, and then I filmed the intro. And if you can't tell by my face, whew, I got a little emotional at the end. And that's because this book, 1984 by George Orwell, is very heavy. It's a doozy, so strap in. Maybe get some tissues. I don't know if you're that type of person. I cry pretty easily for some reason. So yeah, I needed some tissues in this one. So if you want to see how I made this look and discuss the book 1984 by George Orwell, stay tuned. Okay, so 1984 by George Orwell. This was written in 1949, or at least that's when it came out. That's when it was published. Now, there's a part, the very ending of this book, I'm actually gonna need your guys' help with. It's a little confusing for me because I feel like the author's, like the train of thought literally switches like mid-paragraph. So I'm pretty sure I understand what happened, but if what I say at the end is different than the way you interpreted it or know it to have ended, let me know because I could use some help on this one. I also want to really encourage you to read this book. I feel like it's really important right now. At least like order it. You don't have to read it right away, but order it and just have it in your house, because I've heard rumors from other people who love books and people who do research for a living and understand kind of how this stuff works, that this book is going to be updated, which is very ironic since that's what they do in the book. So anyway, just please go and get it. Just have it. You don't have to read it right away. This novel starts with the main character, Winston Smith. He's getting home from work and he's going into the apartment building that he lives in. And when he first enters, there's a big poster at the end of the hall of a man's face who's about 45 years old. He's kind of handsome looking and he has a black mustache. Now the elevator isn't working right now in Winston's building because the electricity has been turned off as part of an economy drive instituted by the party. So Winston has to take the stairs, and he lives on the 7th floor, so that kind of sucks. On every floor, at the end of each hallway, there's that same poster with the man, and it always feels like his eyes are kind of like following you. And there's a caption on it that reads, "Big Brother is watching you." So I just did my skincare. I'm gonna let it set in for a few minutes before I start the makeup. So when Winston gets into his apartment, there's a voice and it's reading off like these lists of figures, and it's coming from a metal screen that's on the wall. I envision it looking like a TV. He goes and he turns it down. You can, dim it, the sound and the image, but you can't turn it off completely. ever. And this thing, they call it a telescreen. So he walks over to his window. He's kind of a small man, kind of skinny, and his overalls that are a uniform that party members wear, his are like blue. I'm assuming they're kind of like denim overalls. They're a little baggy on him, so they make him look even skinnier kind of than he already is. And he's looking out his window out onto the city. You can see that Big Brother poster everywhere. It's plastered on every corner. And so is a word called insoch, I think is how you pronounce it. It is two words, English socialism, that have been smushed together. And we'll talk more about why that is later. So this word is plastered everywhere along with that Big Brother poster. And again, he's looking out onto the city, and there's a helicopter kind of like hovering in between the buildings. And Winston knows that it's the police patrol and that they're like snooping into people's windows. And he doesn't think it's that big a deal. It's a normal thing to occur. Plus the patrols, you don't really have to worry about them. It's the thought police that you really have to worry about. So the telescreen was continuing to talk about these figures, and the telescreen could transmit both ways. So it could transmit messages, audio, visuals to you, but it also transmitted the other way. So it could see everything going on in your apartment. Oh, and these telescreens are in everybody's house. It could see what's going on in your apartment, and it can also hear you. Anything above like a very low whisper, it would pick up. And you kind of, as a citizen, you kind of had to assume that this telescreen was always monitoring you. I mean, there wasn't really a way to know when they were plugging in to your specific screen or not. And no one even really knew if maybe they were just watching everybody all the time. There was really no way to know. So he's looking out onto the city still, and he can see a building off in the distance, and this building is called the Ministry of Truth. And this is where Winston works. And the city that he lives in is London, and it's in the province of Airstrip 1 in the country of Oceania. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. The homes everywhere are kind of rotting, broken down. There's a lot of rubble on the streets from places where bombs had fallen onto the city. And in a lot of these places where the bombs had fallen, it kind of like, cleared an area. And so all these kind of makeshift houses that kind of almost look like chicken coops, people were living in them. And Winston was thinking to himself, he's like, has it always been like this here? He's like trying to remember like from his childhood, but he can't really. It's like very vague, and how your childhood memories are. Like it's kind of like, did that happen? I don't know. It seems like it did, but your memory isn't like solid, like maybe something that you've remembered from your adulthood. So anyway, Winston can't really remember. So anyway, he can see the Ministry of Truth. It's called Mini-True in Newspeak. Now, Newspeak is what I was talking about earlier, where they kind of combine words to make one word. And Newspeak is the official language of Oceania, though it's kind of still in transition. A lot of people still speak English. From Winston's apartment, from his window, on the Ministry of Truth, you can see the party's 3 slogans protruding from the building. And they are: war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. Now, towering above all the other roofs were the 4 buildings of the party. And they were the 4 legs which the government was built on. So the first one was the Ministry of Truth, where Winston works, and it was concerned with the news, media, the arts, books, music, that that type of thing. It regulated that kind of thing. Then there was the Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. There was the Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And then there was the Ministry of Plenty, which concerned itself with like economic affairs. Now, the really scary one was the Ministry of Love. So Winston was home on lunch, but he didn't have a whole lot of food. He had a little bit in his apartment, but he decided he needed to save it for the next day. So instead of eating lunch, he took a shot of Victory Gin and he had a Victory cigarette. So he sits down at a table, he opens the drawer and he takes out a pen and a notebook. Now, for some reason, this apartment was laid out much differently than everyone else's apartments. And there was this tiny little alcove where he had put the table. And if you were sitting in that alcove, the telescreen couldn't see you, which was very unusual. So if you sat there, it could hear you, but it couldn't see you. And it was this kind of strange layout in his apartment that gave him the idea for what he was about to do. Then he had remembered his idea when he was in one of the parole quarters of town. Again, that's a very odd word for me to try to say. Paroles, I think is how you say it. And we'll explain what the paroles are in a bit. Anyway, so he was in this part of town and he found a junk shop. Now, party members were not really supposed to shop at places like this. They weren't even supposed to really be in the parole quarters, but it wasn't like strictly enforced. And they called it dealing on the free market. So anyway, he had found this notebook at this junk shop and he bought it and he took it home. And he kind of felt guilty as he was walking home. Even though he hadn't written anything in it yet, it was still like if he had gotten caught by like a police patrol or something with it, it would be a very compromising position. Now, the thing he was about to do was to start a diary. Now, writing a diary is not necessarily illegal. Actually, nothing was illegal because they don't have laws. But if he got caught, it was presumable that he would either be put to death or at the very least, he would be sent to a labor camp for like 25 years or something. And Winston actually wasn't used to writing with like a pen. Pens and pencils weren't almost ever used even to like write your signature. Instead, everyone used a little machine called a SpeakWrite, which you talked into. But of course, he couldn't use a SpeakWrite for this purpose because the telescreen would hear him. So he wrote very clumsily in like children's type handwriting, April 4th, 1984. He wrote about going to the movies the night before. They were showing some footage from the war that was going on, and it was very violent and it showed like children being blown up, and one of the paroles that was in the audience got really upset about it, and she was yelling and screaming that they shouldn't be showing this with children in the movie theater, but the police came and threw her out. So as he was writing this, he had a memory pop into his head. It was a while back at work, people were grabbing their chairs from their cubicles and they were bringing them into like this kind of communal area where a big telescreen was. And they were doing this because they were getting ready for what they called the 2 minutes hate, where everybody got together and they watched this film on the telescreen. Now, when they were all doing this, and including Winston, two people came into the room that he had seen before, but he didn't really know them. He had just seen them around work a lot. And one of them was a dark-haired girl. And again, he didn't know her name, but he was pretty sure she worked in the fiction department. Now this girl, she looked to be about 27 years old. She wore like a scarlet sash around her overalls, and it had an emblem on it, and the emblem was of an organization called the Junior Anti-Sex League. Now, Winston kind of didn't like this girl. He said that she had she carried herself with an air of just clean-mindedness and wholesomeness that was very kind of fake, and he just didn't like her. In fact, Winston didn't really like women in general, especially the young, pretty ones. He said that they were the most bigoted of the party members, the swallower of slogans, the ones that would be nosy about what you were doing and rat you out. And this particular girl even gave him even more of a icky feeling than normal, because once they had passed in the hall, and he said that he just gave her a look that was like sideways, is what he called it. So yeah, he did not like this girl, and he thought maybe even she could be a member of the thought police, but it was pretty unlikely. Now, the other person that had come into the room was a man named O'Brien, and he was a member of the inner party. And when he comes into the room, everyone kind of grows quiet because he's wearing black overalls, which everyone knows inner party members wear. Now, he was kind of a large, burly man, but despite this, he had a very nice way about him. Winston kind of thought that maybe, he didn't know why, but he just kind of got this feeling like maybe Winston, or maybe this O'Brien, kind of held the same unspoken feelings about the way the world is and about the party. And there was just something about him that made him feel like he could talk to him about these kinds of things openly, as long as they weren't around a telescreen. That was the issue, getting them away from a telescreen. But again, like Winston, this was just a feeling Winston had. There was no way of him verifying this. So O'Brien sat only like a few seats away from him, and the dark-haired girl ended up sitting directly behind him. Then the 2 minutes hate started, and the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, his face came onto the screen, and people started yelling and hissing and getting really upset at the image of his face. Now, Goldstein was a renegade, a backslider. He had once been a founding member of the party, but then he participated in some counter-revolutionary activities. The party arrested him and convicted him, put him in jail, but he escaped somehow. Basically, all crimes against the party had come from his teachings. So he had escaped and was out there somewhere. Nobody knew where. Some people thought it was, you know, he was in another country where his paymasters were taking care of him. Or maybe he was hiding somewhere within Oceania. Nobody knew, but he was out there and he was still conspiring against the party. Now, Goldstein was up on the screen and he was talking bad about Big Brother. He was denouncing the right of the party to rule. He was advocating for free speech, for freedom of the press, for freedom of assembly, and of freedom of thought. Now, behind Goldstein on the telescreen was an endless sea of Eurasian soldiers. And people were getting very upset and yelling and screaming again at the telescreen. Now, Goldstein was more hated than even Eurasia, which was the country that Oceania was currently at war with. Now, when Oceania was at war with one of the other superstates, which we'll talk more about how all that works later, they were usually at peace with the other one. Now, although Goldstein was very hated among the people, there always seemed to still be arrests of people who were conspiring with him almost daily. The thought police would arrest people that they accused of working with Goldstein. There was this supposed vast, shadowy army that Goldstein commanded, and every day members of it were being found and arrested by the thought police. Now, this organization that was supposedly existed was called the Brotherhood, and there were rumors that they put out a book that was full of heresies against the party, and it didn't have a title, so people just referred to it as the book. Now, the Brotherhood or the book was not something that everyday party members would talk about, or, you know, as best they could. They wouldn't talk about it or reference it for any reason. Now, as the 2-minute hate continued, it was starting to get pretty wild. People were getting real upset, screaming and yelling. And the dark-haired girl that sat behind him actually picked up a Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen, and it bounced off. This is how, like, into it people are. And what was really kind of sucky about it, besides the fact that you kind of were obliged to go along with everybody, you kind of had to, or people would be like, what's up with that guy? The really kind of scary thing about it was, even if you didn't want to act like this, even against your own will, you were sometimes just turned into this crazy lunatic screaming and yelling. It was like it was infectious. It was like a violent electric current just going through all the people. But it didn't really get to Winston too bad. Yeah, he would feel like the anger and the hate like rising up at him, in him, but he more directed it towards the party. He felt bad for Goldstein. This 2-minute hate frenzy thing didn't really work on him. But then in the next second, it would kind of start to get to him and be like, yeah, maybe Goldstein is a bad guy. And it was just, you know, it's a very confusing thing, your emotions and how other people's emotions can influence yours. So as this hate was growing to a climax, the face of Goldstein melted into a Eurasian soldier. And it felt like the Eurasian soldier was like advancing you. But then the Eurasian soldier's face melted into the face of Big Brother. And there was a very calming feeling that would come over the crowd. And then Big Brother's face would melt away, and what was left on the screen were the 3 slogans of the party, which was war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. Now at this moment, the crowd broke out into a chant of BB, BB, BB. And this part of the 2 minutes hate particularly annoyed Winston. He could get, you know, kind of pulled into the other stuff, but this part, oh my God, it disgusted him. I mean, of course, he chanted along with them because you had to, but every once in a while there could have been a moment where his eyes betrayed him, where you could tell what he was really thinking as he's chanting along. And it was in this exact moment when something very significant happened. And the significant thing was that Winston and O'Brien's eyes met for just like a split second. And Winston could tell that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as him. It was almost like they were speaking telepathically. And Winston felt like O'Brien was saying, I'm with you. I get it. This is stupid. I'm on your side. Now remember, this scene is Winston recalling this thing that had happened at work while he was writing in his diary. Winston's eyes he kind of comes to, and he refocuses on what he's doing. And while he had been musing in his mind, his hand had continued writing, and he had written "Down with Big Brother" over and over again on the page, and he had filled up half the page with "Down with Big Brother." Now, the act itself was not the crime. It was the thought. He had committed thought crime. And for this, sooner or later, he would disappear. That's what happened. People would just disappear, and they would erase their name from ever existing, from any register, from anything you'd ever done was destroyed and erased. And they called it being vaporized. And Winston knew from this act that he had just done, or from just thinking of the act, that it was going to happen. And then he starts writing in his diary, "I don't care, they'll shoot me in the back of the head. I don't care, down with Big Brother. They'll shoot me, I don't care." Then he remembered a dream he had had. He was in a pitch dark room, and he felt someone on one side of him whisper in his ear, "We will meet again in the place where there is no darkness." And Winston knew that this voice was O'Brien's. So as he's writing, suddenly the voice from the telescreen stops, and there's like a trumpet sound. And the voice says, "Attention, attention, we have news from the Malabar front. Our troops have won a glorious victory." The telescreen gave a very gory description of what had happened, with lots of statistics of how many people had died, how many prisoners were captured, and it was just very gory. Then after that, there was an announcement that the chocolate ration would be reduced from 30 grams to 20 grams. Then after that, the telescreen played "Oceania, 'Tis for Thee." Now, whenever the national anthem came on, you were expected, even when you were at home, to stand. But because of where Winston was sitting, he didn't bother to get up. He knew that they couldn't see him. Now, a ways off, a rocket bomb had exploded. And Winston felt very alone. He felt like there wasn't a single person in the world that he could talk to about this kind of stuff, that felt the same way that he did. The past was dead, basically, and the future was unimaginable. And everywhere you went, Big Brother was watching you, and the voice enveloping you. The only thing that you owned was a few centimeters inside your skull. Now he wondered again to himself, why was he writing this diary? No one would, as soon as he was caught, it would be destroyed and he would be vaporized. Then he had a thought come to him. It was not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane that you carried on the human heritage. So, in other words, he wasn't writing the diary for anybody else except himself. Now, Winston knew that the consequence of any crime was already contained in the crime. Then he wrote in his diary, "Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death." And now that he realized that he was basically already dead, it suddenly became very important to him to stay alive as long as possible. Winston finishes his day, and he goes to sleep. And he has a dream that the girl with the dark hair is walking towards him. And she tears off her clothes and just tosses them aside and just keeps walking towards him. Oh, sexy like. But then he hears a loud whistle come from the telescreen. It's 7:15. This is when office workers have to get up. And the voice from the telescreen says, 30 to 40 group, 30 to 40 group. And Winston stands at attention in front of the telescreen. And there's a woman on the telescreen, and she's like, "Follow me, comrades." And 1, 2, 3, 4. They're like doing stretches and exercises and stuff. These are state mandated exercises. So during these exercises, Winston's mind starts to wander. And he's wandering back to childhood. Since he was a child, like, war had been continuous. There had even been a time when there was a lot of confusing street fighting. But he couldn't remember who had been fighting who. And there was no written record of ever being at war with anyone except who they currently were at war with. Now, Oceania currently was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with Eastasia. And there was no public record of ever being at war with anyone other than Eurasia. But Winston specifically remembered that not just 4 years ago, they were at war with Eastasia, and Eurasia had been their ally. I mean, it's only 4 years ago. It's not hard to forget from that long ago. But officially, there had never been any mention of any kind of change. Oceania was at war with Eurasia and had always been at war with Eurasia. But since there was no public record of this, how could you prove it? The record only existed in your consciousness. How do you prove what's going on in your own mind? That's not necessarily proof of anything. So whatever was true now had always been true. All that was really needed were constant victories over your own memories. And this was called doublethink. Now, doublethink means to be able to hold two contradictory thoughts or opinions in your mind at the same time and believe both of them. To be able to consciously decide to forget something, and then when it's needed again, consciously to decide to bring it up into your memory again, and then instantly, when it's not needed again, forget it again. To consciously choose to be unconscious and to be conscious of that fact that you did that. It's very confusing, and even to use the word doublethink involves the use of doublethink. So after his exercises, Winston goes to work. He gets to work and there's already a bunch of paperwork on his desk. Get a little idea of what Winston's work is like. So on his desk, there are 3 holes, kind of. So basically there's 2 pneumatic tubes. If you don't know what a pneumatic tube is, if you were not around and had gone to a bank in the 80s, you might not know what this is. It's this suction contraption that has little tubes, and if you wanted to get some paperwork from one area to another, usually within the same building, you would put your paperwork in this tube and then put the tube in a bigger tube, and it would suck up into the air and go to who knows where, really. Anyway, so he has 2 of these pneumatic tubes on his desk. One is small for paperwork and one is bigger for newspapers, magazines, books, that kind of thing. Then there's a 3rd hole, which is kind of like has a little metal grate over it. And this is where you put paperwork that you know needs to be destroyed. And it leads down into a furnace where everything is just burnt to absolute ash. So he's going through the paperwork on his desk. There's a message that says times 17,384 to rectify. So Winston punches these numbers into his telescreen, and a few minutes later, out of one of his pneumatic tubes comes a newspaper article from the Times. Now, the message that he had gotten had told him that for one reason or another, this article needed to be altered, or what they officially called rectifying. So Winston would make the necessary changes to the article and then put the paperwork instructing him to do so into the memory hole. And this continual alteration of articles like in the Times, was also applied to newspapers, books, films, photographs, music even. So minute by minute, the past was being altered. And they would even like recall entire books and have them updated and then reissue the updated version. But there was never any announcement or anything that they had done this. They just put the book back out, changed. Now on lunch, Winston ran into his friend Simey. And Simey worked in the dictionary department. He was helping develop the Newspeak dictionary. And he was kind of like a nerd about it, and he loved talking about it. So Winston asked him, he's like, hey, how's the 11th edition of the Newspeak dictionary coming? And Simon was like, oh, it's coming, it's slow, it's, you know, it's not a short process. He's like, everyone thinks that we're inventing new words, but what we're actually doing is destroying words. Every day, little by little, we are breaking down the language to its bone. And he's like, don't you see that, you know, the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. We're trying to make thought crime impossible because there'll be no words to express it. So every year, the range of consciousness becomes smaller and smaller. And Winston's like, except for the Paroles. And Simon's like, oh, the Paroles, they're not human. And he goes on with what he was saying. He's saying that, you know, even the party's 3 slogans will probably need to be changed, because how can you have a slogan like freedom is slavery if the concept of freedom doesn't even exist? If the word doesn't exist, then the concept doesn't either. So while Simon's talking, Winston's thinking to himself, man, Simon is too smart for his own good. He's read too many books, and he just knows a lot of smart stuff. He would even go to a place called the Chestnut Tree Cafe, where artists, painters, and musicians were known to hang out. Even the former disgraced party members had been seen there before, and so had Goldstein himself. So it wasn't hard to predict Simon's future for Winston. He would be vaporized eventually. So as they're talking, he notices at the table next to him is the dark-haired girl, and she was looking at him, staring at him. And when their eyes met, she like immediately looked away. So Winston's like, why is this girl watching me? Then the telescreen let out a whistle, which was the sign to get back to work. Now, Winston was back at home, and he was remembering a time when he had gone to see a sex worker. Now, going to see a sex worker was obviously not okay, but it also like wasn't that big a deal. If you got caught, you'd probably just get sent to a labor camp for like 5 years or something, and especially if you like had never been in trouble before. But what was truly a terrible crime was promiscuity between party members. Part of that reason was to keep men and women from creating strong partnerships. It was also to try to eliminate the pleasure in sex altogether. It wasn't love so much that was the enemy to the party, but eroticism, even within marriage. And marriage had to be sanctioned by the state and, or, you know, the party. And the party would not grant someone getting married if they thought there was any chance that the couple might actually be physically attracted to one another. The only reason to even get married was to have children for the party. And this was really ingrained in people from early childhood. There were even organizations like the Junior Anti-Sex League that encouraged celibacy in both men and women. So this made sex a rebellious act. So then Winston wrote in his diary, "If there's hope, it lies in the Paroles." Now, we're going to explain what the Paroles are. The Paroles are the lower class, like the working poor. And they make up 85% of the population. So Winston feels that if they could just become conscious of that fact, I mean, they outnumber the party by a lot. And there are strength in numbers. So if the Paroles could just understand and become conscious of their own strength, hopefully one day they would rise up against the party. Then he writes in his diary, "They can't rebel until they become conscious, but they can't become conscious until they rebel." Now, the party taught that the Paroles were less than human and that they needed to be kept in subjection, kind of like animals. And this wasn't hard to do because basically they just kept them poor. So when you're struggling to just survive, eat, keep a roof over your head, you don't really have time to think about revolution. They also kept them distracted with alcohol, gambling, just sports. And they would keep, members of the thought police kind of always milling about within the parole quarters to keep an eye on them. But I mean, this wasn't really anything they needed to worry too much about. Most paroles didn't even have a telescreen in their house. So Winston starts wondering again, like, what London was like before the revolution. And he pulls out a children's history book, and it's talking about a long time ago, before the party, the world was just a terrible place. Everyone was poor, they couldn't eat, they didn't have clothes, they didn't have a roof over their heads. But among all this poverty, there was a few really nice big mansions. And inside lived rich men who had servants and this wonderful life. And these rich men were called capitalists, and they owned everything, and everybody in the world were their slaves. So Winston's reading this, but it's like, I mean, how can you know if this is true or not? I mean, life now resembles nothing of like the stuff you hear coming out of the telescreen, or even reflects the principles that the party teaches. So if the party blatantly lies about the present, I mean, you got a reason they probably lie about the past too. And I mean, this is what Winston does for a living. He alters the past for the party. So Winston's mind is wandering into the past, and it wanders into about the mid-1960s. This was a time of some anti-revolution movement, and a lot of people in these movements were being purged from the party. The last 3 men left from these purges were named Jones, Anderson, and Rutherford. They had been pardoned and reinstated into the party. They had written apology letters, and they were published in the Times. Shortly after this, Winston remembers seeing them at the Chestnut Tree Cafe. Now, everyone knew that these men were doomed, basically. Once the thought police had gotten a hold of you, you never truly got away from them. They were basically corpses waiting to be sent to the grave. So they were sitting in the cafe. Winston's kind of watching them. From the telescreen, a song starts. And it's something along the lines of, "Under the chestnut tree. I sold you and you sold me under the spreading chestnut tree. Something like that. So like kind of like a sad song. And Winston looks over at Rutherford, and Rutherford has just like tears in his eyes. And shortly after this had occurred, days, I'm not exactly sure, they all disappeared. So Winston's like still thinking to himself, and he's thinking, you know, their motive behind altering the past is pretty obvious. It's how they control the narrative. But why? Why do they do it? The heresy of all heresies was just having common sense. And the truly frightening thing was, what if they were right? I mean, how do you know for sure? Like, how do you know that 2 + 2 makes 4? Someone told you that it does, but how do you know? I mean, the past and the external world really only exist in your mind. And if that can be controlled, then what? But Winston's like, no. He's like, 2 + 2 does make 4. That is absolute truth. There's no relativism in it. He's like, just get it together, Winston. You know that 2 + 2 is 4. You know it. And as long as that is granted, then everything else can follow. So then he wrote in his diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4. Now, a few days later after work, he found himself wandering the city, and he came upon the junk shop where he had bought the notebook. And so he went inside. And as soon as the shopkeeper saw him, he recognized him as the guy that bought the notebook. And he was like, oh, hey. He's like, are you looking for something particular, or are you just browsing? And Winston was like, oh, I'm just browsing. And the shopkeeper told him, he's like, well, you know, I've got a few other pieces in an upstairs room if you want to take a look. So we took him upstairs, and there was a room that was basically set up to live in. It had a bed, chair, nothing fancy, just a little room. And Winston noticed that there was no telescreen. And Winston goes, you have no telescreen? And the shopkeeper's like, oh no, I never bought one of those. They're too expensive. And Winston kind of had the thought, he's like, this might be kind of like a nice little place to rent pretty inexpensively if he was going to ever take that chance. It was just a thought he had. So Winston leaves the shop, and as he's leaving, he sees coming down the sidewalk towards him is the girl with dark hair. And she see her, and she immediately like changes direction and pretends like she didn't see him. So now Winston's like, okay, this girl is definitely spying on me. So Winston's freaked out by this. He goes back home and he writes in his diary some more. And he also starts remembering again his dream he had where O'Brien told him that they would meet in the place where there is no darkness. Now Winston thinks that he knows what this means. He thinks it means that the place where there is no darkness is some kind of far off, distant future where everything's better, but that he can't really be a part of except in some sort of, mystical way. So 4 days later, Winston goes back to work. He needs to get up. He's going to the restroom or something. And he's walking down the hall. And the girl with dark hair is walking towards him down the hall. And right as she passes him, she stumbles and she falls flat on her face. And Winston, it's instinct. Someone falls in front of you, you go to help them up. And she put up her hand towards him to help her up. And he lifts her up and she's like, thanks, comrade. And then she continues on her way in the direction she had been going. And Winston continues to the bathroom, and he realizes that in the couple of seconds that they were holding hands, she slipped a piece of paper into his hand. And he could not let anybody see this. He goes back to his desk and he kind of just casually tosses it like it's just some piece of paper. It's part of his paperwork or something. And he just tosses it on his desk like it's nothing. And he sits down and he pulls his paperwork towards him and he's kind of like shuffling the papers. He takes the paper that she had given him and kind of flattens it out on top of the rest of his paperwork. So it looks like he's just reading his paperwork. And in large, messy handwriting, it said, "I love you." So after a second of staring at this piece of paper, he like immediately put it down the memory hole and destroyed the evidence. So then when he gets home, he's trying to like think of a way where he can communicate with her without the telescreens or anybody seeing. He considered the idea that she might be like laying a trap for him or something, but he didn't think so because when she handed him the paper, he could tell like she was very nervous and very frightened. So he reasoned that the best way to talk to her would be in the cafeteria at work. So after several days, he saw her one day in the cafeteria sitting at a table by herself. So he goes and he sits at the same table, but like not right next to her, kind of like a few chairs over. And they start like kind of talking to each other very quietly and expressionlessly as like in between mouthfuls of food. So Winston's like, "Where can we meet?" And she told him that they could meet at a place called Victory Square. And he's like, "We can't go there. There's telescreens everywhere." And she's like, "It doesn't matter as long as there's a crowd of people." She's like, "Don't come up to me unless I'm in like a crowd of people. And then don't even like look at me. Just talk to me like we're talking now." So they arrange a time after work for when they're going to do this. So Winston gets to Victory Square and he sees her standing at the foot of a monument, but there's nobody around her, so he can't go up to her. But then all of a sudden, everybody in the square kind of goes rushing to one side of the square, and someone's yelling that there's like a truck full of Eurasian prisoners that are going to be coming by, and everyone wants to see, because that's like the only time they ever see foreigners. So everyone's crowded to one side of the square, and this girl, she goes into the crowd of people too. So Winston makes his way through the crowd until they're standing shoulder to shoulder. And they're not looking at each other. They're looking straight ahead, watching the prisoners and trucks go by. And she says, "Are you free on Sunday afternoon?" And he's like, "Yeah." So she gives him like a bunch of directions on this place where they're gonna meet. Right before they go, she like feels for his hand and gives it a little squeeze. And then they part ways. So Sunday comes and Winston makes his way out into the country. It's about a 30-minute train ride. And he makes his way to this clearing that she told him about. Now, out in the country, you know, in the woods or whatever, there were no telescreens, obviously, but you couldn't assume that you weren't being spied on because they would sometimes still put microphones in like the trees and bushes and stuff. So he gets to the clearing, he's there first, and then she shows up, and the first thing he says to her is like, "I'm 39 years old." Like, she's like, because she's only like 27. So she says, "I don't care." And then they wrap their arms around each other and they start kissing. And then when they, break away, he says, "What's your name?" And she's like, "I'm Julia." And she's like, "I already know your name. It's Winston." And he's like, "You're quite a bit younger than me. What is it that you could see in me?" And she's like, "I don't know. It's just something in your face. Something in your face tells me that you hate them as much as I do." So then they start talking about their mutual hate for the party. They're kind of starting to make out and stuff. And Winston's like, "I hate goodness. I hate purity. I don't want any virtue to exist anywhere. I want everybody to be corrupt to the bone." And she's like, well, you're in luck because I'm as corrupt to the bone as it gets. And then they did it. And when Winston wakes up, he's like, yeah, he's like, that'll stick it to the man. They had just committed a political act. So after this, they're like, okay, well, you know, we have to arrange for when we're gonna meet again. And they arranged some times where they could meet for like 15 minutes here and there after work or whatever. And they, you know, were gonna be in public places, so they kind of had to be careful. So in these short little meetings that they would have these kind of fragmented conversations. And Winston learned a lot about Julia. He learned that, you know, basically her view was that the point in life was to have a good time. And it was the party's objective to keep you from having it. And that this was kind of just the natural way of life. There was no point in trying to revolt. She didn't believe that the Brotherhood existed. Any type of organization like that was pointless anyway. You can't beat the party. So after several weeks of this, Winston decided that he wanted to rent that little room above the junk shop. He wanted them to have a place of their own, kind of. So Winston goes back to the junk shop and he arranges this with the shopkeeper. And the shopkeeper can kind of, you know, he kind of knows what Winston's up to, but he's the type that's, you know, don't ask, don't tell, I'll kind of look the other way. He gets the room taken care of and they arrange a time to meet there. And Winston, part of the reason he wanted to get this room and to have a place for them is because Winston's realizing that he's falling in love with Julia. So anyway, they meet for the first time at their new place. And she shows up and she's all excited. She's got a bag of stuff with her. And she tells Winston to turn around and don't turn around till I tell you. And when she tells him to turn back around, he's expecting just to, you know, see her naked. But she's not. She still has her clothes on, her blue overalls, but she has makeup on her face. Apparently, party members were not supposed to wear makeup. It was frowned upon, let alone you couldn't really get it. And Winston was like, oh, wow, she looks so pretty. He said that it wasn't very skillfully done, but he didn't have very high standards either. After that, they go to bed. Now, when Winston wakes up, he hears Julia yelling, get out of here, you filthy things, and she throws a shoe into the corner of the room. And Winston's like, what's going on? What are you doing? And she's like, there's rats in here. And Winston freaks out. Apparently, he has a fear of rats. And Julia, she calms him down and he feels better after a little while. She's like, don't worry, I'll bring some traps or something and we'll get rid of them. Then she notices that there's like a picture on the wall. And she says, oh, what's that a picture of? And Winston's like, I think it's a church. He's like, it's like 100 years old or something. And Julia's like, you know, I bet there's bugs and stuff behind that picture. She's like, I'll take it down one of these days and clean it. So it's time for them to leave, and Winston's basically thinking to himself that, you know, his relationship with Julia is making his pretty crappy life much more tolerable. She was making life worth living. So sometimes when they were together, they would, you know, kind of fantasize about revolting or sabotaging the party somehow. Winston told Julia about this kind of secret intimacy that he thought he had with O'Brien, and that sometimes he just had the urge to just walk up to O'Brien and be like, I hate the party, I want to rebel against it, and you're gonna help me. But again, Julia was like, there's no point, the party's invincible. The only way to like really rebel was with like, you know, secret acts of disobedience like they were doing, or with, you know, one-off random acts of violence. Winston argued that maybe in like small groups of people, if you could gather evidence and stuff like that of what the party truly was, maybe they could leave it behind for future generations. And Julia, she's like, I'm not interested in future generations. I'm interested in us. And Winston was like, you know, you're just a rebel from the waist down. And she kind of thought this was great. She was like, you know, you're right, and I like it that way. And it was beginning to dawn on Winston through talking with Julia that the party more easily imposed itself on people that were not capable of understanding it. People could be made to accept the most flagrant violations of reality because they didn't grasp the enormity of what was being asked of them. They weren't interested in public affairs and events, then they wouldn't even notice what was happening. It was by their lack of understanding that they stayed sane. And this was the essence of the slogan, ignorance is strength. So some days later, Winston runs into O'Brien at work. And O'Brien was like, oh, hey, I'm glad that we ran into each other because I read one of your articles. I thought it was really great, but I noticed that there were 2 words that you used that are now obsolete. And he was like, do you have the 11th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary? And Winston's like, no, I didn't think it came out yet. And he's like, oh, well, I have an advanced copy. If you like, you can come by my house. I'm usually home in the evenings, and I'll give you mine. And Winston was like, okay, yeah, that's great. And then they go about their ways. And Winston's like, okay, this is a signal. O'Brien is telling me that if you would ever like to talk to me, here's where I can be found. He felt like it was some kind of a invitation to be able to speak candidly with him. So Winston tells Julia about this encounter, and Winston and Julia decide to go to O'Brien's house together. So when Winston and Julia get to O'Brien's house, his servant lets them in. And I thought this was funny too, because supposedly only the evil capitalists had servants, but here a party member has a servant. Hypocrite. So the servant lets them in. He takes them to O'Brien's office. O'Brien stands up from his desk, and as he's walking over to them, he stops at the telescreen and he turns it off. And Winston's like, you can turn it off? And O'Brien's like, yeah, we can. He's like, we have that privilege. And then O'Brien says, so shall you say it or should I? And Winston's like, I'll say it. We're here because we believe that there's some kind of secret organization out to take down the party, and we believe that you're a part of it, and we want to join and help. And right then, the servant comes back into the room, and he has some glasses and some wine. And Winston's like, oh, crap, did he hear that? And O'Brien's like, don't worry, he's one of us. O'Brien's like, why don't we sit down and talk? The servant pours their wine, and O'Brien holds up his glass, and he's like, so why don't we start by drinking to our leader, Emmanuel Goldstein? And Winston says, so he's real? And O'Brien's like, yeah, he's real, but where he is, I don't know. And Winston's like, and the organization, it's real? It's not just made up by the thought police? And O'Brien's like, oh no, it's real. He's like, we call it the Brotherhood. But that's about all you'll ever learn about it, except that it exists and you're part of it. You'll never meet any other members. And this is how we keep the members of the organization safe, is they never know each other. So O'Brien's like, well, so you want to join? Okay, well, I gotta ask you a few questions first. He's like, are you prepared to give your lives? Are you prepared to commit murder, to betray your country, to commit suicide, all in service of the Brotherhood? And they say yes. And he says, are you prepared to be separated? And Julia's like, no. And Winston actually kind of had to think about it for a second, but eventually he says no. And O'Brien says, okay, that's good to know. He says, later I'm going to get you a copy of the book, and it will explain the society that we live in and the strategy that we're going to use to defeat it. He says, you know, right now the best we can do is just spread sanity from person to person, and hopefully it will grow generation to generation. So O'Brien asks Winston, he's like, I'm assuming that you will have some kind of a hideout or something, and Winston tells him about their little apartment that they are renting over the junk shop. And O'Brien says, okay, that's good, that'll do for now. We'll get you something else later. He's like, in a few days, someone will tap you on the arm and say, oh, sir, you dropped your briefcase. And the book will be in that briefcase. And then O'Brien's like, okay, that should probably be it for this first meeting. He's like, but we shall meet again. And Winston interrupts, in the place where there is no darkness? And O'Brien says, yes, in the place where there is no darkness. So Winston received the book just like O'Brien said he would. And it was odd because on that same day, Oceania started to now be at war with East Asia and not Eurasia. Now there was no official announcement of this, it just kind of became known. So Winston goes to their little apartment and he starts reading the book. There's no title on the book, but the first page says the title, and it's The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism by Emmanuel Goldstein. And chapter 1 is Ignorance is Strength. And it goes on to explain that since the beginning of time, there has always been 3 groups of people: the high, the middle, and the low. And that even after great upheavals, this same pattern repeats itself over and over. And then for some reason, Winston decides to skip ahead to chapter 3, which is War is Peace. So it explains that in the middle of the 20th century, Europe was absorbed by Russia, and that Britain was absorbed by the United States, and that these were 2 of the 3 existing superpowers. North America, South America, Britain, South Africa, and some of the Pacific islands, I believe. I'll put a map so that in case I say this wrong. Those became Oceania. And then most of Europe, Russia became Eurasia. And then like India became East Asia. Now these 3 super states were continuously at war and had been so for the past 25 years. And there didn't seem to be any real material reason for the fighting. And there wasn't even any type of like ideological reason. No one of the super states could be overthrown by another, even if the other 2 joined up against one, because they were all just so evenly matched. And each one of these superpowers could easily produce everything that it needed to be whole within its boundaries. So they weren't fighting over resources, they weren't fighting over ideologies. What they were fighting for was labor power. So between the borders of these 3 super states, there's a region in North Africa and the Middle East that contains 1/5 of the Earth's population. So whoever could possess these areas would also possess the people. Now these people were reduced basically to slaves and continually passed from one conqueror to another. And they were used to make armament, weapons, stuff for war, so that they could capture more territory, so that they could capture more people, so that they could make more armaments. And it just goes on in that cycle. So the primary aim of this warfare was to use up the products of warfare. Now in the past, the manufacturing of weapons for war usually meant an increase in wealth for the overall population of a country, especially for the middle class. But the hierarchy realized that if the wealth of the middle and lower classes rose, that was a threat to their positions of power. If wealth increased among the population, then so did leisure and security. And if leisure and security were available to the masses, this means that they would have time to become literate and understanding of the fact that those in the hierarchy at the top didn't really serve a purpose, and that they would eventually wipe them out. So to combat this, in the 20s and the 40s, most of the countries in the world, their economies were allowed to stagnate. And they did this by commanding that large portions of the population were not allowed to work, and they were kept half alive on state charity. So the problem was, how did they keep industry turning while not increasing the overall wealth of the population? So the only way to do this was through continuous warfare. And it was a deliberate policy to keep even the more favorited populations somewhere near the brink of hardship. And this was because when there's a general state of scarcity, even the smallest little privileges can create a distinct divide between people. So with being conscious of always being at war, this makes people very fearful. And when people are fearful, it's very easy to convince them to give up all powers and rights to a small sect of people who convince them that if they do that, the small sect of people will be able to keep them safe. And the people see this as, a necessity in order to survive the war. So it seems that the two aims of the party are mainly to conquer the earth and to extinguish all independent thought. So all three superstates seem to have the same pyramid structure, the same worship of like a semi-divine dictator and an economy that's based on and for continuous warfare. Now, the three superstates would gain nothing by conquering each other. And in fact, all three of them keep each other propped up through this continuous warfare. So the war that's being fought is not country against country, but ruling classes on its own subjects. And the point of the wars is to keep the structure of society intact. Now, Winston's reading all this, and he is finding it fascinating, though the book isn't telling him anything he doesn't already know. But the best books always tell you what you already know. So it goes back to chapter 1, Ignorance is Strength. Now, it explains that for a long time, the high has been able to maintain their power. But in most cases, what would happen is the middle would realize what's going on and then enlist the low in their fight against the high. The middle would overtake the high and then become the new high, then pushing the low back into their place. And then a new middle would come about, splintered off from one or both of the high and the low. Now, from the point of the low, what's the difference, right? Just the name of their masters has changed. But with this most recent revolution, the high, or the middle that had now become the new high, had a conscious strategy that they were going to use in order to maintain their position as the high. So there were new technical advances that would enable instruments to be able to transmit, both simultaneously transmit and receive transmissions which they used to put an end to any type of private life. Now, collectively, the party owns everything in Oceania, including any products being produced, and they get to dictate where the products are distributed to as they see fit, which you can only guess means to them. Now, for years after the revolution, the new high convinced everyone that this was all being done in an effort for equality and collectivism. But in reality, it made inequality permanent. And the masses would never revolt because they didn't have a standard of comparison. They weren't allowed to talk to foreigners, and they had altered versions of the past. So they weren't even, after a few generations, they weren't even aware that they were being oppressed. And Big Brother was the guise in which all of this was expressed. So Big Brother isn't a real person. Now, Julia had gotten there at this point in Winston's reading. So he started reading out loud to Julia because she was supposed to have read this book too. Now, up until this point of the book, Winston wasn't hearing anything he didn't already know. He understood how, but he still didn't understand why. He noticed that Julia had fallen asleep because obviously she wasn't that interested. So he decided he was going to take a break from the book and he was going to go to sleep too. So when they woke up, they started discussing the book. And again, Winston came to the conclusion that hope lied in the Paroles. He knew, without even having read the end of the book, that this was going to be Goldstein's final message. Sooner or later, it would happen. Strength would become consciousness. And Winston says to Julia, he's like, we can play a part, but we are the dead. And Julia agrees. She's like, yeah, we are the dead. And then they hear a voice say, yes, you are the dead. And they're like, what? And Julia's like, it came from the picture. And then the voice says again, it came from the picture. And the voice says, remain where you are. It was starting. Everything that they knew would happen had begun. And the voice was like, stand back to back, put your hands behind your head. And then there was a crash of glass. And the picture of the church fell to the ground, and behind it was a telescreen. Then there was the sound of boots coming up the stairs, and then a bunch of black uniformed men came in, and they beat up Julia and then drug her out. And then after that, the shopkeep owner came into the room. He had ratted them out. Winston realized that he was a member of the thought police. Then they beat Winston up and put him in a van. Then they put him in a cell that had very high ceilings, no windows, and all the walls were white porcelain. And there were 4 telescreens, one on each wall. They never turned the lights off. He was in the place where there is no darkness. He was in the ministry of love. Now, periodically, the guards would bring other prisoners in and out. And one of the prisoners that they brought in was named Parsons. And he was Winston's neighbor. And Winston was like, what are you in for? And Parsons is like, for thought crime. And Winston's like, did you do it? And Parsons is like, of course I did it. The party wouldn't arrest an innocent man. And he was like, well, how'd you get caught? And he was like, my children ratted me out. And then the guards came and they took him away. And so different prisoners kept coming and going. And one time this lady came in, and when the guards came back for her, they were like, come on. They're like, to room 101. And Winston said the color in the lady's face just went out of her face, and she just looked absolutely horrified. Then another time, a man came in, and he was extremely skinny and obviously dying of starvation. Now, when the guards came back for him, they said the same thing. They're like, come on, you're going to room 101. And he just like flipped out. He's like, no, please, please don't take me to room 101. I've told you everything. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. I'll confess to whatever you want. And he like grabbed onto the like a bench thing, and they basically had to drag him out of there. Then again, he heard boots coming down the hall, and the door opens, and it's O'Brien. And Winston's like, oh my God, they got you too? And O'Brien's like, don't bring this stuff in. O'Brien's like, oh yes, they got me a long time ago. And then one of the guards come from behind him. And the guard beats Winston unconscious. Now, they would beat him frequently, and they would question him relentlessly for hours and hours. They would try to trip him up, twist his words, and they were doing this as a way to destroy his ability to argue and to reason. And in the end, they broke him down, and he would say whatever they wanted him to say just so it would stop. He confessed to everything, even to things that he didn't even do. Now, after one of these beatings, he came to lying on like a table or some sort of like camp bed thing. And he was strapped down. And standing next to him was O'Brien. And on the other side of the room, there was a man in a white lab coat. And he had a hypodermic syringe. So O'Brien, standing next to him, looks down at him and he says, don't worry. He's like, I've been watching you for 7 years, and I'm going to save you. I'm going to make you perfect. And O'Brien had his hand on a dial. And all of a sudden, Winston felt this wave of really intense pain, and it like made his body tense and contort. And then O'Brien turned down the dial and the pain left. And O'Brien told him, he said, okay, now that was 40 and this dial goes up to 100. So O'Brien continues on and he says, Winston, you are mentally deranged. But don't worry, it's curable. You suffer from a defective memory, but you're clinging to your disease like it's some kind of virtue. He's like, do you remember writing in your diary that freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 = 4? And Winston says yes. O'Brien holds up his fingers and he says, so how many fingers am I holding up? And Winston says 4. And O'Brien says, and if the party says 5, then how many fingers? And Winston says 4. And then O'Brien turns up the dial. And Winston's full of pain again. He turns it down. Again, he says, how many fingers, Winston? And Winston's like, 4. Turns the dial up again, higher this time. Turns it back down. How many fingers, Winston? 4. Turns it up again. Turns it back down. And each time he turns it, it gets more painful. And he says, how many fingers, Winston? And finally, Winston just says, 5. And O'Brien's like, no, you're lying. How many fingers? And Winston's like, 4, 5, I don't know, whatever you want. And then he goes unconscious. Then when Winston comes back to, O'Brien's like, you're a slow learner, Winston. He's like, you gotta try harder. He's like, I know. It's not easy to become sane. And then they just torture him with this machine over and over. O'Brien asks Winston again, how many fingers? And Winston is exhausted from just the continuous hours of torture. And his vision is blurry and his consciousness is like in and out and he can't really make sense of things. And Winston looks at his fingers and he's like, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. And O'Brien says, better. O'Brien tells Winston, you know, the party is not interested in your overt acts of crime. They're interested in your thought to commit the crime. The thought is all we care about. So Winston asks O'Brien, he's like, I know that eventually you're just gonna kill me, so why are you even bothering to torture me? And O'Brien tells him that they're not looking for blind obedience. They truly want to bring them over to their side, to genuinely convert them. Once they make the conscious decision and truly believe in the party, then they'll kill him. Then O'Brien holds up his fingers again and he says, there are 5 fingers here, Winston. How many fingers do you see? And Winston answered, 5. And he truly believed it. So then O'Brien tells Winston, he's like, before we conclude our session here, are there any questions that you have for me? And the first question that he wanted to know was, what happened to Julia? And O'Brien told him that she betrayed him, like, immediately. Then Winston asked, does Big Brother exist? And O'Brien says, of course he exists. He's the embodiment of the party. And Winston's like, no, like, is he like a real person? Does he occupy, you know, a particular point in space the way I do? And O'Brien tells him, he's like, it doesn't matter. He exists. Then he asks, does the Brotherhood exist? And O'Brien tells him, you'll never know the answer to that. Winston asks O'Brien, what's in room 101? And O'Brien answers by saying that you know what's in room 101. Everyone knows what's in room 101. And then Winston feels a needle in his arm and he passes out. So in their next session, O'Brien asks Winston, he's like, do you remember writing in your diary that you understand how, but you don't understand why? And Winston's like, yeah. And O'Brien says, well, you read the book. He's like, do you know why now? So Winston says to O'Brien, you've read it? And O'Brien says, I wrote it. And Winston asks, so is it true then? And O'Brien says that yes, in its description, but it's really just all nonsense. He says, I know what you think. The proletarians will never revolt. The party is indestructible. It will be here forever. Forever, Winston. He's like, now tell me, what's our motive? But Winston still didn't know. So O'Brien tells him, we are interested in power simply for power's sake. We are not interested in doing good for others. We only want power. And Winston argues with him. He's like, it's impossible to build a civilization based on fear and hatred and cruelty. It'll never endure. And O'Brien says, why not? And Winston says, I don't know, but there's something in the will of man or some sort of spirit that it just won't work. And O'Brien says, the spirit of man, really? He's like, do you consider yourself a man? And Winston says, yes. O'Brien's like, get up from your bed. And the straps loosen. He gets up and O'Brien says, take off your clothes. Winston strips down to just like his underpants, and O'Brien takes Winston and he walks him to a 3-way mirror. When Winston sees himself in the mirror, he involuntarily lets out this like huge cry. He sees this like skeleton thing walking towards him. He's got scars and bloody wounds all over him. But what was truly frightening was how skinny he was. His knees were thicker than his thighs, and he was kind of crouched over, and his face was hollow. And O'Brien says, look at the condition you're in. He's like, you're rotting away. He's like, you're a bag of bones. You're filth. He's like, this This is the spirit of man. This is what's going to overthrow the party. He's like, put your clothes back on. So Winston goes to get dressed again, and he just breaks down in tears. And O'Brien's like, we've beaten you, Winston. And Winston's like, I haven't betrayed Julia. And O'Brien's like, that's true, you haven't. Winston had confessed and told them everything that him and Julia had done. But he had not stopped loving Julia. So this is what he meant by he hadn't betrayed her. And O'Brien knew that's what he meant. And Winston asks O'Brien again, he's like, when will they shoot me? And O'Brien says, you're a difficult case, but don't worry, nobody leaves here uncured. Eventually, they will shoot you. So weeks, or possibly months, Winston doesn't know, has gone by. And they've started feeding him, and he's growing stronger and feeling better. And he'd come to realize that you can't fight against the party. And he didn't want to anymore because, you know what? They were right. He had accepted everything. The past was alterable and yet had never been altered. And he wondered again to himself, he's sitting in the cell, and he's wondering again, when are they gonna shoot me? He knew that it was the tradition that they would shoot you in the back of the head when they were walking you down a hall, like unexpectedly. There was no warning. Now, even though he had come to accept the party and the doctrine, he still loved Julia, even though he wasn't supposed to. And he had to keep this a secret. He had also realized through everything that the best way to keep a secret is to even keep it from yourself. So to lie to yourself about it. What he wanted to be able to do was to truly not love Julia anymore. To be able to tell them that he didn't love her anymore and truly mean it. But he wanted to still be able to not let the party win. He wanted to be able to recall his love for Julia seconds before they would shoot him. This way, there would be no time for them to reclaim his mind. And he felt that that would be his way of winning. He wanted to be able to love Julia, hate the party, right before they killed him. And that means he would have died a free man. So as he's thinking this, he suddenly hears the guards and O'Brien come into his cell. And O'Brien says to Winston, he's like, you've betrayed me. He's like, you've been making good progress. It's only emotionally that you're not making progress. He's like, tell me, he's like, what are your true feelings for Big Brother? And Winston tells him, I hate him. And O'Brien says, okay, it's time for the last step in your transformation. He's like, room 101. So they strapped him to this upright chair. I mean, he's really strapped down. Even his head is like strapped down, but he's sitting up. And O'Brien says to Winston, he says, you know, you asked me one time what was in room 101. And he's like, you know what's in room 101. Everyone knows what's in room 101. What's in room 101 is the most terrible thing in the world. And then right then, one of the guards comes into the room. And he's holding some sort of wire contraption, and it's got like a handle on the top of it. O'Brien goes on and he says, the worst thing in the world varies from individual to individual. Then Winston can see like a clearer picture of what this thing is that just came in. It's a wire cage, and on one side of it, there's like a fencing mask type of thing. And inside the cage are rats. And it sinks into Winston what this is for. And he's like, no. He's like, you don't have to do this. He's like, I'll confess to anything you want. He's like, what do you want me to do? And O'Brien says, I want you to do what's required of you. Then they take this metal cage thing, the mask part, and they strap it to his face. And Winston can see that, so it's this long cage contraption, right? But there's like a divider in it. and the rat is on one side of the divider, the part that's farthest from Winston's face. O'Brien explains to him how it works. He's like, if I get the answer I don't like, I'm gonna push this button, the rat's gonna fall to your face, and it will burrow through your face and eat your face away. Oh. Did you just see that spit? He's like, if I get an answer that I like, then it won't happen. We'll take the mask off. And Winston just becomes hysterical and screaming, and he thinks, you know, I need to turn myself into somebody else to survive this, like in his mind. And the first person that he thinks of is Julia. And so he starts screaming to O'Brien. He's like, do it to Julia. Don't do it to me. Do it to Julia. And this satisfies O'Brien. And he takes the mask thingy with the rat off of Winston's face. So the next time that we see Winston, he is sitting in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. And he's looking up at the poster of Big Brother. And the caption says, Big Brother is watching you. So Winston's mind wanders a lot these days. And he's tracing his finger in the dust that's on the table. 2 + 2 = 5. And O'Brien's words that he said to Winston, what happens here is forever, are repeating in his head. And he was right. Now Winston had seen Julia one day in the park, and he just like walked right up to her, and she seemed different, of course, and she had like a scar on her face, and she looked up at him and she just said, I betrayed you, kind of blandly, blatantly, with little emotion. Winston repeated, I betrayed you too, in the same manner. And Winston, they go to leave. That's all they really wanted to say to each other, I guess. And they go to leave. And Winston says to her, he's like, you know, we should meet again. And she's like, yeah, we should. But they never did. Back in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, the telescreen starts singing that song. Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you, and you sold me, however it goes, was the same song that had been playing when Winston had seen those discredited party members. Same song was playing, and it made Winston cry. Then the voice on the telescreen had an announcement. There was some great victory in the war against East Asia. Some great victory that could very likely bring the war to an end. And the whole cafe and people out on the street were celebrating, and Winston, very reserved, was happy about it, and he felt in his heart that this was a good thing. Now this is the part I'm a little confused. So he's sitting at the cafe, he's thinking these things, and then literally in the middle of the paragraph, he's then back in the Ministry of Love. He's walking down the corridor, and he says that he can feel the bullet enter the back of his head. And he looks up and he sees the poster of Big Brother, and he feels love for Big Brother. He had done it. Winston had done it. He had gained victory over his own mind, and he loved Big Brother. And that's the end. That's the end of the book. It's a very sad ending. It makes me a little emotional. I thought it was gonna end like he had planned, with him dying a free man and loving Julia again. Why did I bother to do my makeup? I don't have a fan. Yeah. Now, as I was reading this book this whole time, you know, you read a book and you put yourself in the place of the main character usually, and you think, oh, well, what would I have done? And through this whole book, Everything that Winston did, I was like, yeah, I would probably do that. I would think that. The only place where I thought a little differently and I expected a different response out of Winston was when he was showing him himself in the mirror and he was all like sickly looking, and O'Brien was saying, oh yeah, this is what's gonna, you know, overthrow this totalitarian government. And Winston broke down crying because he realized, like, yeah, like, how can I? But I think at least the response that I had when reading that, if I was looking at myself like that, I would see somebody with nothing to lose. And a person with nothing to lose is a very dangerous person. So anyway, that was just the one little thing that I kind of had a different perspective on. Now the Paroles, Winston thought were going to be the ones to think this. But the Paroles, again, they were just, you know, barely hanging on. But they did hang on. They had things that, they had little pleasures in life, sports, gambling, little things like that. But Winston, I don't know, maybe it's just saying that like a certain amount of intelligence is required. I don't know. I'm starting to ramble now. Anyway, at the end of this book, there's a little afterthought by a man, I don't know, I can't recall his name, but he kind of explains some of the stuff that happens in the book. Now, this book, you know, is obviously very depressing. But what's even more depressing is that this book isn't talking about like some other country that's far away from you. You know, it's talking about humanity as a whole. Like this stuff happens in the world today, but most of us think of it happening somewhere else. But this type of need for power in a small minority can envelop and take over the entire world. There can be kind of like two reactions that or messages that you can take from this book. And the first one is just to resign yourself that this is the way things are and think like Julia did, like it's just impossible to do anything about it. Or you can realize that there's still time and that each of us individually need to be able to find clarity and strength and courage to not let this happen in the first place. Orwell was insisting that this type of world is bound to happen unless humans have some kind of renaissance of spirit. He wasn't trying to prophesy some, you know, terrible future. He was trying to warn us and to awaken us. He still had hope, even though it's a desperate hope. So yeah, that was 1984, a classic. And I just really hope that you all will get this book before it's too late. Let me gather myself for a second. So, please leave me a comment if you have any thoughts on this book. I would love to hear them. If you have a better explanation as to what happened in that last paragraph, it's just kind of one of those parts where like, I think I get it, but maybe I didn't. I don't know. I'm pretty sure I did, but maybe I didn't. Maybe you have some thoughts on it, and I would love to know them. If there's a book that you would like me to do, let me know in the comments. That's the best way to get a hold of me. And if you liked this video, make sure and give it a like. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so that you won't miss when I upload new videos. I really do like doing this books and beauty, my beauty and the bibliophile series that I've just started here. Yeah, I think I want to continue with them. And if you would like to continue watching them, make sure and subscribe. And I will see you in the next video. Bye. You can see down in the city, like that poster that a big Now, writing a diary isn't necessarily, which was, and Winston could tell that O'Brien but it wasn't a typical, the act itself wasn't, why can't I say the act? Then he remembered a dream he had had. Winston remembers seeing East Asia. No. So these three superstates basically all have the same pyramidal. So O'Brien says, "You've read it?" And O'Brien, why can't I get this part? Unconsciously, he's tracing in the dust on the table that he's sitting in. 2 + 2. Baba, please. I'm almost done. I'm almost done, Bob. Come here. Come here. Come sit in my lap. Where are you? Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. I'm not going in the bedroom. No, come here. Someone wanted to join us because she can't be quiet. You want to listen to the ending of the story? Hmm?